We are live. So, good morning, everyone. We at Regional Science Center Bhopal, a unit of National Council of Science Museums, we are with you once again in this very difficult time where we all are facing COVID-19, but now everything is coming online once again and resuming all the activities. So we have with us today our very guest speaker, Dr. David Grinspoon, and also Mr. Krishnendu Chaudhary, Project Coordinator of Regional Science Center Bhopal, and my colleague. So I will ask him, please give welcome address for today's program so that we can start program. Krishnendu ji.
Very good morning to all the viewers of the channel of Regional Science Center Bhopal. Let me first introduce our center. Regional Science Center Bhopal is a constituent unit of National Council of Science Museum, and we are mandated to popularize science, and our main goal is science communication, so that science can reach to the remotest location of the India. And as because we are situated in Bhopal, our main concern is to reach to the remotest location in the Madhya Pradesh. Well, we are doing a lot of activities on this online platform, and right now we are again here with a very special person, Mr. David Greenspoon. He's an astrobiologist and a prize-winning author and a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute. His research focuses on climate evolution on Earth-like planets and potential condition for life everywhere in the universe. He is involved with several interplanetary spacecraft missions for NASA, and there are many works. However, I think the main important part is he has been associated with, he knows Carl Sagan very closely, and a person who is admired for his TV series on cosmos in around 70s, which got which actually got a lot of popularity. So I welcome David Greenspoon to highlight about the Carl Sagan and his experience and how well further detail we can know about Carl Sagan.
Yeah.
So over to you, Mr. David Greenspoon. Thank you very much from Regional Science Center Bhopal.
Yes. So, Dr. David, for our viewers, since viewers they are waiting and they must be very curious to know about you. So I will add a bit of few lines about your science communication and your science writing angle to my colleague, Mr. Krishnendu ji's comments. So Dr. David is also involved in NASA's and European Space Agency and Japanese Space Agency known as JAXA's missions. And very popularly, Dr. Grinspoon's writing has appeared in very famous science magazines, newspapers, and on other platforms like Scientific American, Natural History, Nautilus, Astronomy, Seed, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and very important for astronomy enthusiasts, Sky and Telescope magazine, where he is contributing editor and writes the quasi-monthly Cosmic Relief column. He is author and editor of several books, including Lonely Planets, and won many awards, which includes Penn Center USA Library Award for non-fiction, and very important for today's talk because he is going to address as a memories of Uncle Carl. So Grinspoon has been a recipient of the Carl Sagan Medal for Public Communication of Planetary Society of Planetary Science by the American Astronomical Society and has been honored with the title Alpha Greek. Without further ado, very quickly I'll bring few lines. He lectures widely and appears frequently as a communicator on television, radio, and podcast, including as a frequent guest on a very popular Star Talk Radio, which is a podcast on space, science, and popular culture hosted by none other than Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he is a very close friend of with our today's speaker, who is a renowned astrophysicist, popular science author, director of Hayden Planetarium in the New York City. And one more important thing, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson also got inspiration in childhood from Dr. Carl Sagan. So this is a very big connect, and because Dr. Grinspoon is going to host a new spin-off Star Talks, which is known as Star Talk All Stars. And also, for all of us, for all of you, I would like to bring one more aspect of him. He is a musician who currently leads the house band of the universe. So now stage is yours, Dr. David Grinspoon. Please, sir, carry on.
Thank you very much. It's a honor and a pleasure to be with you. I was going to say this evening, but I'll say this morning, since it's morning where you are. And I wish I could be with you in person. I've been one time to Bhopal. Actually, last year I spoke at the MANIT at the National Institute of Technology, and it's a beautiful place, and I would love to come back sometime. But right now, it seems like since then, that seems like a long time ago. The world has changed a lot since then, and we're all dealing with this very difficult time, and we're doing the best we can. And so given that, I'm very happy that I can virtually be with you right now to celebrate Dr. Sagan's birthday and talk a little bit about Carl Sagan, who I grew up calling Uncle Carl. And so this is actually kind of an unusual talk for me to give. It's not a talk I've given before. I talk about Carl Sagan a lot in my work because I am a planetary scientist and astrobiologist, and he was a pioneer in our field. And I refer to him a lot because he was a very important friend and family friend of mine. But I've never given a talk about the relationship before, and it's not something I talk too much publicly about, even though I know people are interested, because I'm not sure, you know, I guess I never wanted to feel like I was bragging or showing off, because a lot of people are kind of in awe of Carl Sagan, which is understandable because he was a pretty awesome person, you know? So I've never actually given this kind of a talk, but I'm gonna give it a try here for you, and I'm pleased to be asked. So what I thought I would do would talk a little bit about three things. One, about Carl as a person and growing up as a kid around him, and a little bit then about him as a scientist and the important science he did, and then a little bit about him as a public communicator and even a political activist. And by the way, I'm very happy to be giving this talk through your center, because as you described it, as a center of public communication of science is a very important thing around the world, and was the most important thing to Carl Sagan. So it's very appropriate. So anyways, I'm going to share my screen now because I have some sort of snapshots I want to show you. And I could sort of hold up some pictures like this, but I think they'll be more clear if I show them to you shared on a PowerPoint. So I'm going to do that now. Let's see, make sure this works. There we go. Okay, so like I said, I grew up calling him Uncle Carl, and that is because that is how I was told that I should address him. He was not my biological uncle, but he and my father were very best friends, and our families were very close, and we spent a lot of time together. And this is actually a picture of Carl Sagan on the left and my father, Lester Grinspoon, on the right. And this picture is sort of funny to me and to people that knew them, because they weren't usually dressed like this when they hung out together. It was usually more casual, but this is actually a picture at Carl's wedding, and my father was best man at that wedding. In fact, he was best man for Carl twice. Carl in his life was married 3 times, and my father was best man at 2 of those weddings. So that gives you a sense of how they had a long and very close friendship. And so growing up as a kid, Uncle Carl was at our house a lot, and the 2 families would go on vacations together. And his kids were some of my best friends. His son, Dorian Sagan, was my age, and we were best friends when we were kids. We're still good friends. Dorian Sagan is a science writer. and we would go on vacations together, the families. Here is, whoops. Oh, no, that is what that is what I wanted to show next. So Carl's mother was really good friends with Lester's mother, my grandmother, Sally. And just as a little example, my mother just gave this to me, actually. My father died earlier this year. And so my mother is going through his things. And she gave me this. This was a copy of Carl's novel, Contact, that he signed to my grandmother, my father's mother. And it says, "For Sally, with fond good wishes to my mother's dear friend and my best friend's mother." So that was very sweet, and just gives you a sense of the two families being close. I knew Carl's parents too, Sam and Rachel Sagan, and I went and stayed with them sometimes in their house in New Jersey. So the two families were close, and this is actually kind of fun. This is the same book that Carl inscribed to me. And it says, "For David, who inspired pages 16 through 18 with fond good wishes." And pages 16 through 18, if you don't have the novel, it's you may have seen the movie of Contact, but the main character, Ellie Arroway, who's a girl who grows up to be a famous astronomer and discover extraterrestrial life. But there's an experience she has when she's a girl that's described, that is on page 16 through 18 of this book, which Carl told me came from a story that I told him of an experience that I had once. So I won't go into detail now, but if you read the book and you get to page 16 through 18, you'll know that character is a little bit based on something that that happened to me. Anyway, so here we are. This is a family scene. I think this was New Year's 1967, I think. So that's me in the middle there, sitting on the chair in my helicopter pajamas, which I wish I still had. Those were pretty cool. And on the floor there in the foreground is sitting on the floor is Carl Sagan with I think a glass of champagne, because we were toasting the new year. And next to me is my brother Danny. And behind Carl is his wife, Linda. And then the woman on the lower left, that's my mother, Betsy. So this is just sort of a typical family scene, hanging out. And I think I have one more snapshot from around this time. Oh yeah, this is Carl reading to my little brother, Peter, and my brother, Danny, sitting next to them. And Carl was very fun to be around for kids. He was an adult who was very attentive to kids and playful, but also very into teaching kids about things and challenging you, and respected kids. You know, I think some adults, when they talk to kids and they don't necessarily talk down to them, they know that kids can understand a lot and be pretty smart. And he was that kind of an adult to be around when we were little. Just one thing I was remembering was that he would tell us these bedtime stories, you know, and kids go to bed and the parents are putting them to bed and they tell them stories. And there was this very elaborate serial story, meaning it had different episodes. And that I think Carl was just making up, and he would tell us a different, different chapters, but it was about, I wish I remembered the details more, but it was about some guy who was supposed to be the 7th best swordsman in France. I think it was the 7th best swordsman in France, and about all these battles and, intrigues and things that happened. And it was just this very imaginative thing that I don't know how he was coming up with it, but this was what we had as a bedtime story when we were little. And then moving on to the science interest, he, when I got a little bit older, I realized that my father's best friend was an astronomer and was doing this really cool stuff and studying planets and stars, and would talk about it in this very exciting way. And he would show up at our house sometimes with the pictures from the latest Mars mission. And this was before the internet, of course. So having an actual physical photograph, to show you was something. It wasn't like everybody had already seen it online. It was like, here's a new picture from Mars. Like, wow. And so this is on the upper left is the Mariner 9 spacecraft, which was the first Mars orbiter in 1971. And I was 11 years old then. And Carl was very involved in that mission. And he would show up and bring these pictures by. And here's a couple Mariner 9 pictures just to give you a sense of the kinds of things were being discovered. On the bottom right here is Olympus Mons, which is the giant volcano, the largest volcano in the solar system. And on the lower left is one of these features that Mariner 9 discovered. There were all these ancient features carved by water on Mars, and that Mars was a planet that used to be more Earth-like and have flowing water on the surface. We didn't know that before this mission in 1971. So it was this very exciting time of discovery. And it was amazing to have this this close family friend who was very involved in this stuff and was very excited telling us about it. So naturally, I got very kind of sucked into wanting to be a scientist and wanting to know more about this stuff. Eventually, I did become a scientist, and well, as a student, I worked some summers in Carl's laboratory, and this is a picture of him at his laboratory at Cornell University. He was when he and my father became friends. They were both professors at Harvard University. Carl in the astronomy department, and my father in the medical school. But then, actually, Carl was denied tenure at Harvard, which is pretty surprising because he was such a superstar. But there was some strange, I think, political reasons. It's a little unclear. But he ended up moving to Cornell University, and that's about a 5-hour drive from where we lived in Boston. But we would often go down there for weekends and stay with the Sagans and hang out, go for walks in the woods around there and so forth. But this is his laboratory at Cornell, and I ended up working there summers when I was a college student. And this is where he did these experiments where he was trying to simulate the chemistry that was going on some other planets that might be similar to the origin of life chemistry on Earth, where you take organic molecules and you mix them in these flasks and you add various kinds of energy sources, ultraviolet radiation or electrical discharges, and you see what kind of chemistry you can form. And so I learned how to do this kind of work working in his laboratory some summers. And this is a picture of Carl in that laboratory. I'm going to show you a couple more sort of family type snapshots, and then I'm going to move on to talking a little bit more about Carl's science. But this is in the summer around, now this is, I'm obviously, I'm older here. I'm about, I think about 20. I'm a college student, and this is sitting out by the pool, and you can see Carl and I talking. I don't remember what we were talking about, but it looks like he's telling me something, and I'm listening very carefully. I'm the guy with all the hair there. This was my phase when I had a big head of hair. And in the lower left, that other guy is, I think that's Steve Soter, another astronomer, and he that you mentioned in the introduction, the television show Cosmos. And that is Steve Soter was the co-writer of Cosmos with Carl. And by the way, he had an interesting style of writing where he never wrote anything down. He carried around with him a little cassette recorder. This was before digital recorders, but it was just, a cassette tape and a little recorder. He always had it in his pocket, and he would write by walking around and talking into this thing. And then he had a secretary that would transcribe everything he said. But he had the amazing ability to talk in complete paragraphs and complete sentences perfectly the first time. It wasn't like a rough draft. It was amazing. He would say like the perfect sentences and the perfect paragraphs, and it would come out exactly the way it would end up being published. And I remember when he was writing Cosmos, because the Sagans were visiting us, we would go in the summers, we would rent a house at the beach on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And he was visiting us, and he would go for these walks on the beach with his little recorder, and he'd be walking up and down the beach and talking into that thing. And he was writing what turned into Cosmos. So anyways, as a scientist, there's obviously a lot you can say about Carl's work and career, but I think of him foremost as a pioneer of planetary science. He was a very important figure in really the first generation of planetary scientists. In the 1960s and 1970s, we were sending the first ever spacecraft to all these planets. Venus, the first spacecraft in 1962, called Mariner 2, excuse me, and then the first spacecraft to Mars in 1964, and then the first Mars orbiter in 1971, and the first Venus landers in the 1980s. All these sort of things were happening for the first time. It was a very exciting time, and Carl was really very much involved in these early missions. And out of that work, we gained the ability to do what we call comparative planetology, where we can now look at these similar planets. And I have here Venus, Earth, and Mars, because to me that trio of worlds is very fascinating, because they're sort of like siblings that have gone in different directions, brothers and sisters, where they started out similar but ended up very different. And through the comparisons between those planets, we learned so much about all of them, including learning a lot of essential new things about our home planet, the Earth, from these comparisons. And Carl was really a pioneer of that. And a lot of, especially the first generation of planetary scientists, of which Carl was one, they took a lot of the techniques of Earth science, from geology and meteorology, studying the surface and the atmosphere and the geology, and applied them for the first time to understanding other planets. So it was a very exciting time, and Carl was very much a pioneer of that. This is a paper that he wrote in 1961, which where his career was just getting started, and this was a review in Science magazine, which was a big deal about the planet Venus, and it's a really fun paper to read now. It's, for one thing, it's a really beautifully written paper for a science paper. It's very elegant, and it describes the state of our knowledge in 1961. And one thing he says, and you can see it in the upper right here, this paragraph, is that they're trying to figure out if the eventual manned missions to Venus should they send a paleobotanist, a mineralogist, a petroleum geologist, or a deep sea diver. In other words, they didn't know if Venus was an ocean world, so they should send a deep sea diver, or there was one theory that it was covered with oil, or there was one theory that it was just a desert, and there was one theory that it was sort of had all this vegetation, and they were just figuring out what it was really like on the surface. This was sort of looking at all the data at that time, and it's just amazing that here we are now, almost 60 years later, and we figured out a lot. We know it's not an ocean world. We know that it's not a jungle planet. It's more of a desert planet, really, but there's still so much that we don't know, and we're still continuing on that exploration that Carl really helped to start. of course, he was very important in Mars exploration. I already mentioned the Mariner missions, but he also was one of the prime movers of the Viking missions, which were the very first Mars landers. And this is a picture of Carl with a duplicate of the actual Viking lander in a desert area in Colorado in the United States, where they were sort of taking the lander out and kind of practicing in a desert area on Earth to see how it would work. And this mission, Viking, they were not only the first successful Mars landers, but they carried with them instruments to look for life on Mars, biology experiments. They didn't find life on Mars, but we learned a lot about the environment there, and we're still searching for possible life on Mars or possible evidence of past life on Mars. And that's something that today we call astrobiology, but then in Carl's time it was called exobiology, and it was much more of kind of I wouldn't say fringe thing, but it was considered much more speculative. Now astrobiology has become more mainstream because we've learned so much about the extremes to which life can adapt on Earth, and we've learned so much more about the other planets, which makes us believe that we probably will find life eventually if we keep looking. The more we learn about life and the more we learn about planets, we don't know yet, but we believe there probably is life we can find out there. Carl always believed that, but at that time, it was not as mainstream a belief. It sort of took more courage to be an exobiologist at that time. But he was very committed to this idea that that life is something that probably exists elsewhere in the universe, and that using scientific exploration, we should be able to find it. And that was the driving quest behind this Viking mission that he was so involved in. The other mission I want to talk about is the Voyager mission. The Voyager 1 and 2 were our first two spacecraft that went to the outer solar system. And you can see one of the artist depiction of one of the Voyager spacecraft on the upper left here. And then on the right is a collage of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, pictures from Voyager, which it was an amazing mission. Launched in 1977, encountered Jupiter in 79, Saturn in 1981, Uranus in 1986, and Neptune in 1989. And Carl was very involved in this mission, and you've probably heard about the Voyager record, which was the message that was put on the side of this spacecraft, in case any extraterrestrials ever find it, because Voyagers, the trajectory that they were on, they were moving so fast after they did the gravitational assist of Jupiter, and then did a swing by of Saturn and picked up more energy from Saturn's gravity, and then Uranus and Neptune. And by the time they passed Neptune, they were moving so fast, they're fast enough to escape from our solar system entirely. There are only 5 spacecraft that have ever been launched fast enough to escape our solar system. The 2 Pioneer spacecraft, the 2 Voyagers, and now the New Horizons mission that went past Pluto. Those are the only 5. And so they said, since Voyager is going to escape the solar system and wander forever, let's put a message on it. And they actually put a record album on the side. You've probably heard this story, but Carl was very involved in both the science of the mission, and it was basically his idea, and with a small team of other people, they assembled this message to put on Voyager. I got to work as a summer research assistant at the Voyager Jupiter encounter in 1979 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. It was a very exciting experience because these Voyager encounters are exciting because, the spacecraft is traveling for years to get to Jupiter, and then it's a flyby. It doesn't go into orbit. It goes past, the gravity pulls it in and it gets flung out of the system very quickly. So it's just a matter of days that it's close to Jupiter after traveling for years. And so they're snapping pictures and doing all the measurements in a very short period of time. So being there when the flyby was happening was with all the scientists, Carl and all the other scientists who had been working on this project for years, was so exciting. And I was an undergraduate assistant for Jupiter. And then by the time Voyager got to Uranus, I was a grad student in planetary science working with the Voyager team. And then by the time Voyager got to Neptune in 1989, I was a postdoctoral research associate working with Voyager. So the Voyager mission in particular had this quality of, because it took so many years to get from planet to planet, the people working on this project, it became like a family. And these encounters were like family reunions where everybody, you know, we're getting to another planet several years later and everybody converges and there's a frenzy of work and excitement. And then you sort of scatter for a few years and you get to the next planet and everybody's a little bit older and people have been married and had kids or been divorced, or some people were no longer with us by Neptune who had been with us at Jupiter. So it was a very intense experience. And at the last Voyager encounter, Neptune in 1989, before Voyager, you know, it's still going, but there's no more planets for it to encounter. We're still in touch with Voyager, by the way, which is pretty cool. And now it's in interstellar space. But at the last Voyager encounter with Neptune, there was a big party. And Chuck Berry, the musician, the pioneering rock musician, played at that party at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was really cool because Chuck Berry, his song, Johnny Be Good, is on the Voyager record. So if any aliens ever find this thing out there in a million years or whatever, they'll be able to hear Chuck Berry singing Johnny Be Good. And here's a picture of Chuck and Carl at that party at the final Voyager encounter with Neptune. Speaking of communicating with aliens, Carl also was an early champion of the idea of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And here he is with at Cornell with a Pioneer plaque. So before the Voyager record, I mentioned the Pioneers were actually the first spacecraft that are escaping our solar system. And there was a little plaque they put on board with a picture of a man and a woman and the spacecraft and some other information that would tell the aliens where and when the spacecraft came from. You can see on the bottom there, there's the diagram of our solar system showing that it came from the third planet and swung by the fifth planet and then outwards and all this other information. So they would know something about the builders if they ever found it. And he was also involved in the early efforts to listen for radio signals from extraterrestrials. And he took very seriously this idea that there might be other intelligence out there in the universe. And one of his early successes was writing this amazing book called Intelligent Life in the Universe with a Russian scientist named Joseph Shklovsky, who was, he was kind of the Carl Sagan of Russia, I guess, a very famous scientist in Russia. And what's amazing about this book is that these two men collaborated with each other on this book. It was during the Cold War, so relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were very tense, and it wasn't easy for them to collaborate. They never met each other at the time they wrote this book. They only did it by sending manuscripts and mail back and forth, and they had this intense correspondence. And they ended up producing this book, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And it's an amazing book. It's still, if you read it today, it still holds up. There's so many incredible ideas about the evolution of life and the evolution of planets and the evolution of possible intelligence elsewhere. It's a fantastic book. It's just the story of how these two people managed to collaborate with each other during the time of all this tension between their governments and sort of forge this cosmic view in which the conflicts between our countries are not as important as the big picture unfolding in the universe. It's really quite an achievement. And I had the experience many years later. I actually I was on a spacecraft team with the European Space Agency, had a mission called Venus Express, And I was on the science team for that mission. And we had a meeting in Moscow in 2007. And it was on the 50th anniversary of the launch of Sputnik. And so I got to go to Moscow, and I got to go to the Sternberg Radio Institute where Shklovsky worked when he was collaborating with Sagan on this book. And Shklovsky is no longer alive, but they've sort of preserved his office because he's, you know, one of the most famous Soviet scientists. And I got to go to his office and sit in his desk, which was really cool. And then I'm sitting in his desk and I look up at his bookshelf, and there's a big picture of Carl there on the taped to the wall. And so this is Shklovsky's office as it's been preserved since his death. They left all his books and everything there. And I got to visit it in Moscow in 2007. And there was Carl smiling down from his bookshelf. Let's see, I wanted to talk briefly also about Carl Sagan as a teacher. He was a teacher and a mentor, certainly to me, but also to many planetary scientists. I mentioned he was sort of in the first generation of planetary scientists, and he really sort of helped train the next generation. And this is on the left here, this is a picture of Carl with some of his early students. And all of these people went on to become really important and famous planetary scientists. On the left there is David Morrison and Joe Vaverka, and then there's Carl, and then Jim Pollock. Jim Pollock was Carl's first grad student when he was teaching at Harvard, really the first student that he ever trained. And there's Jim Pollock when he was older at his office at a NASA research center. And when I finished graduate school, I did a postdoc at that research center. It's called Ames Research Center. And my advisor there was Jim Pollock, who had been Carl's first student. And then I got to work with Jim as my advisor. And Pollock was an amazing guy, a really just brilliant and kind and wonderful person. And one of these people that just sort of seems to know everything. And also very patient and a very good teacher. He trained an army of students in understanding how he was a master at what we call radiative transfer, which is how radiation travels through planetary atmospheres. And he taught me how to model radiative transfer and lots of other things. And so, you know, there's this sort of generational aspect in science where one generation trains the next and they train the next. And when I look at these pictures, I feel sort of a part of that. And by the way, I wanted to mention, because all these pictures I've shown so far are of men, and that was also probably more typical of that early generation of planetary scientists, although there were some women involved. But I wanted to mention also that Carl was very much a champion of women in science, even though I don't have any pictures of that loaded up right here, that he was very encouraging and supportive and really believed in sort of increasing the diversity of people in our field. Let's see. So yeah, as a mentor, he also, to me, he was just very active in communicating. I don't know if you can really read this, but I just sort of at random in my files on my desk, I pulled out a few of these letters. He was always just sort of sending off notes. I don't know if you can read this, but it says, you know, one of these: "Dear David, I thought the enclosed article by somebody on a possible biological origin of the odd amino acids at the KT boundary might be interesting if you haven't seen it." And the next one says, "Dear David, we need a name for our frozen Earth. What about impact cryosphere?" That's because he and I were working on this study together of the possibility that early Earth was frozen because of impacts stirring up dust, asteroids hitting the Earth and stirring up a lot of dust and cooling off the surface. And then this last one on the right says, "Dear David, I read your interesting paper in JGR Planets. when you get a moment, why don't you think about terraforming Venus? Running the greenhouse to higher surface temperatures looks easy. How would you make a massive decrease in surface temperatures? So he was always sort of thinking outside the box. He read this paper that I wrote about Venus climate, and it gave him an idea about, you know, some possible scenario in the future where we might be able to alter the climate of Venus, which is pretty far out, but it's, you know, it's the kind of things that scientists that model planetary climate think about sometimes. And, you know, he was just a very, as a scientist, he had a way of cutting to the essence of a problem. I remember I was struggling. That impact dust study I mentioned was part of my PhD thesis. And Carl was helping me a little bit with that research. And I remember one time I visited him in his office and I said, you know, I'm really having trouble modeling the climate effect of this dust because it's really complicated, you know, because there's so many variables and, you know, how do I know if I'm doing this right and that right? And Carl said, you know what, you're making it too complicated. You could do this in a really simple way. And he got out a pad of paper and he said, look, here's the cross section of these particles. Here's the radiation flux. And, you know, he just wrote a few elegant equations and he said, just do it like this. He made me realize I was sort of making it more complicated than I needed to. And, you know, that's just sort of an example. He had a very intuitive sense of what the really important aspects of a scientific problem were. The next thing I want to talk about for a few minutes is Carl as a communicator. And, you know, I think these days we're used to the idea that scientists are communicators and should be communicators. But in Carl's day, it wasn't as accepted that a, quote, a serious scientist should also spend a large part of their career communicating with the general public. And Carl did a lot of that. He went on television and, you know, he wrote very successful books and so forth. And at times, I think a lot of other scientists in the field didn't approve. They thought he was, you know, trying to bring all the attention to himself, or I don't know, they suspected his motives. And I think nowadays scientists are more appreciative of other scientists who communicate because they realize that it's important. Well, it's important to educate the public, obviously, because scientific literacy is so important, but it's also important for our field because we're supported. Our research is supported by the public. I'm supported by NASA, which comes out of, you know, public tax money. So we should explain what we're doing and why we do it, and try to share the excitement and share the knowledge, and shouldn't sort of be hiding as a priesthood that and thinking that communicating with the public isn't a valuable thing to do. So I think Carl got a lot of grief for that, but then I think eventually the scientific community came to really appreciate that he was doing us a huge favor by helping the public increase the public visibility and excitement for what we were doing. But that now has become, he's very much became appreciated by the field, even if at the time maybe there was a little suspicion because they weren't used to it. It was a new thing for a planetary scientist to be on TV and doing that much publicly. But now the Division for Planetary Sciences of the American Astronomical Society, which is the main organization of planetary scientists in the United States, and in fact, it's an international organization now too, they've named a medal after Carl, the Carl Sagan Medal for public communication of planetary science, which is a wonderful thing. And one of the great honors of my career is that I was, several years ago, I was awarded the Carl Sagan Medal. And that was just a wonderful thing for me, both because Carl is an important person to me, but also to be honored for communication of planetary science. And just to show you, here's a picture in the upper left of me being given the medal, and Guy Consolmagno, who's another well-known planetary scientist who was the chair of the DPS at that time, is putting the medal around my neck there at the left, and then there I am on the right giving my my public address. the crowd there when I was given this medal, and you can see I'm wearing the Carl Sagan medal. So that was a very proud moment for me. As a communicator and popularizer, Carl was just in a class by himself. There was nobody that was as magnetic and exciting talking about science. And here he is. This is a picture of him on the Johnny Carson show, which was a very popular evening talk show for years in the United States. And Carl was a regular guest on the Johnny Carson show, which is an amazing thing for a scientist, because most of the people that go on there are, they're movie stars or other kinds of celebrities. So to have a scientist who would go on there and Johnny would ask him about, spacecraft going to the other planets and astrobiology. Well, then it was called exobiology. And Carl would just talk about it in this way that was so magnetic and entertaining that, I think people that were otherwise waiting to hear movie stars and pop stars would be enthralled by Carl Sagan talking on television about science. So that was just a really amazing thing. Now, I mentioned that that Carl was, it was not always appreciated by the scientific community because of some of that popularization, which sort of had, people weren't sure how they felt about it. But there was another aspect too, which was that he was also a political activist. There were causes that he was very involved in because of things he believed in and that came out of his science. And one of those was about nuclear weapons. He was very involved in the effort for nuclear disarmament. That was, something that I think came out of his science. He did the study on what he and colleagues called nuclear winter, where they realized that if there was a nuclear war, the damage would be not just from the horrible bombs themselves destroying cities, but that the effect on the planet would be such that there'd be so much smoke and dust and material from burning cities that would go up into the stratosphere and cover the planet with a cloud of particulate material. And they calculated that a full-blown nuclear war would actually change the climate of the Earth and induce what they called nuclear winter, which would mean that nobody would win. There's no way anybody would win a war like that because the entire planet would suffer. And so it just made the absurdity of the possibility of nuclear war that much more extreme when they realized this phenomenon called nuclear winter. So he became very involved in advocating for nuclear disarmament. And here's a picture at the nuclear test site in Nevada in the Western United States. And this was a protest at the nuclear test site. And on stage there, you can see, let's see, my cursor's working. There's Carl speaking on stage, and next to him, there's my dad, Lester. And they were involved in this together in advocating for nuclear disarmament. I was there too. I brought a busload of, I brought a van load of students and faculty from the University of Arizona, where I was in grad school at the time. I think I might have taken this picture. I don't even remember, to go up and join in this. And they were advocating for a nuclear freeze, a stop to nuclear testing and a freeze in the number of nuclear weapons as a first step towards disarmament. And that day, both Carl and my dad, Lester, were arrested. This was sort of a plan that they were going to cross over the fence into the nuclear test site and get arrested. Again, famous people getting arrested to sort of draw attention to this cause that they were very concerned about. And actually, here's some headlines about protesters being arrested, and you can see that it says among those arrested were the astronomer Carl Sagan and the actors Martin Sheen, Chris Christopherson, and Robert Blake. And there on the bottom left is Carl getting arrested, and they put handcuffs on him and put him in the bus with the other prisoners. Here he is looking out the window, smiling out the window of the bus. Well, it turned out that they weren't in jail very long, and they were released pretty quickly. And in fact, that night we all had dinner in Las Vegas. But you know, the point was to draw attention to this cause that he was very concerned about. And, you know, it's an interesting question of whether a scientist should be an activist like this. There's some people that say they shouldn't because they want to preserve their authority and their neutrality.
Sorry to, sir.
Which
sorry.
is...
Hello. Sorry
Yeah.
to interfere. Yes, sir. So
Yes.
we have 8 minutes left. So other aspects you might be covering, then we will
Okay.
take questions. Yeah. So you may move on, sir, on other aspects.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap up.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Yeah, I'll wrap up now, and then because we should do Q&A. Okay,
Yeah.
So the last thing I was going to say was just that you know, Carl was very concerned enough about some of these issues that he decided that it was important enough that he would be an activist, and that, you know, that was more important than preserving the air of scientific neutrality. So, you know, the last thing I wanted to mention was just this pale blue dot photograph that very famous, that Voyager photographed the Earth after it made its last encounter with Neptune. It turned around and photographed our own planet. And Carl was very involved in saying, you know what, Voyager, it's not necessarily for science, but just to see it. And you can see this little speck on the right center there. You can barely see it, and that's the point. And there are these beautiful words that Carl wrote that I won't read out loud now. I was going to read out loud, but we're a little bit behind the time. But he's basically just saying that that dot shows how small and how unified we are, and makes it very silly, the idea that we fight over anything on this planet. That you know, I'll just read the last sentence here. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Carl Sagan. And with that, I'll stop. So hopefully we still have a few minutes for questions here, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Yes, sir. So,
and I'd be very happy to take questions.
yes, sir. So thank you. And it would be great if you will also bring a few aspects of Dr. Carl Sagan's. Since we are receiving a few questions, we will definitely put before you. So in the meantime, you can sort of give a brief information about his love about music, movies, other than reading, and what sort of reading he was involved in as an enthusiast, as a scientist, as a reader himself. Yeah.
Yeah, so he, at his house in Ithaca, he had a huge library of books. You can see behind me this wall of books, but his whole house was like that. And he, you know, he obviously science, but he was a lover of all kinds of literature and science fiction. He was a fan of science fiction, and he would suggest to me books to read, science fiction books to read. But he, you know, I think he was very well educated at Shakespeare, the classics, very, very broadly read. And he was also, yes, definitely a fan of music, a lot of different kinds of music, classical music, rock music. And then you can hear, if you listen to the Voyager record, there's a lot of music from around the world. So I think he had very broad tastes in that, and yeah, popular culture, definitely movies. I mean, he was obviously involved in consulting for 2001: A Space Odyssey and some science fiction movies, but he was also just, I think, a fan of good drama. Yeah, he was definitely into culture in all different kinds of ways, for sure.
Okay. And in addition to that, since he was also very much involved, uh, he was very much involved in your education as well. So while you were pursuing your PhD, during submission of your PhD thesis, he was also reviewing or giving you comments. So what is your views on that? How you were feeling that Dr. Carl Sagan was just giving personal inputs to you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. It was very impressive because, you know, at this time, you know, when we first knew him, he wasn't famous at all. He was just this astronomer we knew, and it was very. I was going to mention this, I forgot to, but it was very interesting to watch him get famous, have that view of somebody that you know very well, that nobody knows who he is, and then by the time you're older and he's older, he's like this world famous person. But what was impressive to me was even after he was very famous, he was always very involved in the details of the science. And when I sent him some chapters of my PhD, he was advising me on 2 chapters of my PhD. We were collaborating on some of it. And when I sent them to him, he gave me, you know, such detailed comments, obviously comments on the science and if he thought I needed to consider this or that, but also just like, you know, he would tell me if I was spelling something wrong or, you know, he would just like the amount of attention he paid. I was just very impressive, you know, that he would, and it was very generous that he would devote that much time to really helping make sure that everything was right.
So, Carl Sagan was involved in SETI, that extraterrestrial institute. I just want to understand how did he describe about the UFO and what was his belief about the UFOs? If you can just say something.
Yeah, so, you know, I think he was very skeptical of UFO reports. It's an interesting thing because I think he believed that there were extraterrestrials out there because, you know, just for the mathematics of, you know, like a lot of people, if you think through the mathematics of how many planets there are out there, how many stars, and the probability, even if it's a very, very low probability of life in any one planet, and a very low probability of intelligence evolving on any planet, there's a number of places adds up so that you convince, when you do the math, you convince yourself, well, there's got to be somebody out there. And I think Carl believed that. But at the same time, I think he was very skeptical of UFOs. He looked into it. He studied UFOs. But I think he became convinced that most of the reports were because of psychological or misinterpretation. He was not convinced that we were actually being visited. It was interesting because he was open to the idea. It was like, you know, the X-Files, I want to believe. You know, I think he wanted to believe, but I think he was also a very skeptical and critical scientist. And I think he fundamentally concluded that that there was no good evidence that we had been visited.
Yeah, we'll be taking few questions from our comment box from our YouTube channel. So one very esteemed visitor who is from US only, and he is just watching this program, Dan Pelisso, suppose Carl is alive today, what do you think he would want to say to the world?
Oh man, it's something I think about a lot because I think he was a very wise person, and it's like he always knew what to say. So ever since he's been gone, I find myself many times thinking, what would Carl say about this? You know, when I think about what the right thing to say is, I try to imagine. I think today he would be very concerned about global warming and climate change. In fact, he was the first person I ever heard talk about. He was talking about global warming, back in the 1980s, before it became a big, got the attention that it has now. So I think he'd be talking about climate change, and I think he'd be very concerned about international cooperation and the need for human, to identify as human beings on the planet, even while we all identify in other ways too. I think he would just be saying, he'd be saying it more eloquently than I can say it, but he'd be saying that we need to think of ourselves as human beings on a planet that has problems that can only be solved collectively, and that's what we need to be focusing on with climate change and other issues.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So one visitor is asking, in fact, I should say, though, who is watching right now, do you remember your father and Dr. Carl Sagan were there while Apollo 11 launching was taking place? What they were talking all about? Do you have any idea? Your father and Dr. Carl Sagan.
I don't remember. I have very vivid memories of watching the Apollo landing. I mean, I was very young, I was in the 4th grade. I don't really remember their conversation about it. But around that same time, I have a memory that's from around that same time, which was going to the premiere of the movie of 2001: A Space Odyssey. The Boston premiere, and Carl had been somewhat involved in advising. And I remember the conversation after the movie between Carl and my father talking about all the mistakes they had made with the science in the movie. And there weren't many mistakes because the movie was very well done. They paid a lot of attention to the science and tried to get everything right. But there were a few things that they noticed, and they noticed everything that wasn't quite right in the movie, like when the lander landed on the moon in 2001, the dust swirled around on the moon. And Carl said, no, that wouldn't happen because it's a vacuum. It would just shoot straight out. It wouldn't swirl around. And my father had some comment about on the scene where they're on the way to the moon in the space shuttle, and the guy falls asleep. And he falls asleep like this, even though he's in zero gravity. And my father, because he was a doctor, he said he wouldn't fall asleep like that in zero gravity because these muscles that hold your head up are stronger than the muscles that pull your head down. And so he fell asleep in the wrong position. So they were picking apart the movie and talking about every little thing they noticed that wasn't quite right. And I remember that conversation because as a kid, I was like, wow, listen to these guys.
Oh, that's fantastic, sir. Sir, one of our colleagues, Swapnil, he is asking, since you are an astrobiologist, so what are the promising areas in this field in these days, and in which area you are involved particularly?
Well, there are a number of things that are promising. I mean, the one thing that's very exciting is the exoplanets. That now that we've discovered planets around other stars, which we always suspected were there, but now we know that most stars have planets. But we don't know very much about those planets yet. But we're building the next generation of telescopes and spectrometers so we can start to investigate their atmospheres. And that's exciting because that's one way we might be able to detect extraterrestrial life is through the chemistry of atmospheres. Like if you were an alien looking at our solar system, you would notice that Earth's atmosphere is very strange with the oxygen and the methane, and it's strange because of the presence of life. So that's one way you could detect life on another planet is by using spectrometers to look at the atmosphere. So we're starting to do that with exoplanets. That's exciting. But then in our own solar system, we're exploring Mars, and we're sending a spacecraft to Europa, which is the moon of Jupiter with a possible ocean on the inside. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the planet Venus. And we've made this recent discovery that may or may not be true. It's being debated right now. There's this weird gas in the atmosphere of Venus called phosphine, which has been reported. And if it's really there, it's very unusual gas. It shouldn't be there in Venus, and it could even possibly be a biosignature. So, I mean, you have to be skeptical and careful with this, but there's this possible discovery on Venus now, which could be related to some kind of life form living in the clouds. And I'm saying this carefully because I don't want to say we've discovered life on Venus, because I'm a careful scientist. All I'm saying is we might have found this gas which could have an exotic explanation. And so some people are trying to figure that out now. But I'm involved actually now in a couple of plans to send new missions to Venus, which I'm interested in anyways, because it's a planet that we could learn so much from about climate and about the history of Earth-like planets. But in particular, there's a possibility of some kind of life forms in the clouds of Venus, just because, you know, the surface is very uninhabitable because it's so hot. But the clouds, it's kind of cool, and there's interesting chemistry. So that's one thing that I'm interested in, is exploring further the clouds of Venus. But with exobiology, with astrobiology, we really have to explore widely, and we have to be sort of humble and realize, well, we only have one planet with life, so there's so much we don't know about where you could find life. Maybe it's underground on Mars, maybe it's in one of these icy moons, maybe it's in the clouds of Venus. And so I think the thing we have to do is explore widely and be on the lookout for anomalies, but also realize that any anomaly we find might have other explanations too, and sort of keep searching until we find it.
Fantastic, sir. And just one more question out of my curiosity, and I think it is also very much relatable with all the readers who actually is reading or have read about Carl Sagan. Before Cosmos and post Cosmos, what do you think as a persona, as a personality of Dr. Carl Sagan? Because you have been watching him since your childhood. So before Cosmos era and post Cosmos era, being a scientist, how he was different?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because he, you know, yeah, I did get to observe that whole trajectory of his life, of going from, you know, of becoming much more famous. And obviously he became much more in demand. And we was getting all kinds of invitations to do television and meet with famous people and become part of various movements, political movements and everything. And so I think to some degree, his science, I wouldn't say his science suffered, because he maintained an involvement his entire life in the science, even while he got more and more involved in this other communication and activism and so forth. But you know, he didn't spend as much time in the laboratory. And I know, like, his students at Cornell would complain that he wasn't there a lot of the time. You know, he'd have somebody else filling in his lectures because he'd be off filming a TV show or off, you know, meeting with the Pope or whatever, you know, doing important things. You know, I think it's, you know, you could criticize him for that, but I think he also felt like these other things he was doing were very important, because he was very concerned about the issues that he was involved in. So I would say, to some degree, his focus on his science became, you know, he became less focused on it because he had these opportunities to do other things. And, you know, I think probably of anyone I've ever known, in a way, I think Carl worked the hardest of anyone I've ever known. Like, he was always working, even on a vacation, and we would go on vacations together, but he would bring a manuscript with him, or you know, he was very productive. So he always kept a hand in the science. He never gave it up, but I think he was also kind of pulled in a lot more directions post-Cosmos.
Oh, so one more thing before wrapping this session, sir, do you have any memory or any idea he had visited India while filming Cosmos series for one of the episodes? So do you have any idea about Carl Sagan's visit to India in connection with the Cosmos?
Well, I know that he did visit. Yeah, I know that he did film there, and I remember him talking about it being a magnificent experience, being there. And I wish I had I don't really have a more specific memory of something he said about it. I wish I did. But I do remember that it made a big impression on him, and that he was thrilled by the experience of going around the world to film Cosmos. And I remember he was sort of talking about the highlights of that, and and his visit to India was definitely was a big highlight of that for him. But I don't really have a more specific memory of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Before wrapping, I would say, sir, since science belongs to everyone, to the entire planet, and as Louis Pasteur said, it doesn't belong to any borders. So from tomorrow onwards, our science centers in India is once again reopening for the public. So on this birthday of Dr. Carl Sagan, very good opportunity. I would request my colleague and PC of this science center to say a few words about reopening our science center. Then we will wrap up this session. Krishnenduji.
First of all, I would like to thank viewers and definitely David Grinspoon for giving such a wonderful lecture and covering the span of Carl Sagan as a scientist, as an activist, as well as a mentor. We got to know a lot of things from your talk, and definitely Science Center is opening from 10th tomorrow, which is again International Science Center Science Museum Day. It's a great day for the Science Center community all over the world, and opening Science Center for the public, and again a greatest opportunity on the very special day. Okay. We'd like to invite all our visitors who are anxiously waiting to visit Science Center, and we hope with this kind of activities which are now opening for the visitor will help them in the future too. And definitely visiting Science Center is a good thing for their career and as well as to understand science in a broader way. Okay. I thank you all the viewers of the channel as well as the media who are watching us. Thank you, David Greenspoon, and my team in Regional Science Center Bhopal for conducting this wonderful program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnendu, and thank you, Dr. Greenspoon, once again for giving your quality of time. And actually, you are the one who is actually celebrating Dr. Carl Sagan's birthday, because right now you have just crossed 13 minutes before post midnight. So that is actual 9th in United States right now. So thank you so much for joining us, and be in touch with our council and our science centers for the cause of science communication. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.